You open the listing expecting one thing. You've been searching for a while now. You have a number in your head, a price point you've been working toward, saving toward, adjusting your expectations around. And when you finally type it into the search filter and hit enter, what comes back is not quite what you pictured. The homes at your number look different than you imagined. Different from what your parents describe when they talk about what they bought. Different from what your friends in other cities seem to be getting at the same price. Different in a way you can't immediately explain from the version of the house that existed in your head before the search began. Hello, I'm Lincoln, and there's something about housing prices that almost nobody explains clearly. Not the price itself, but what that price actually buys in different places, and why the same number can mean completely different things depending on where you're asking the question. There's a story most people carry into house hunting. A quiet assumption, rarely examined, rarely named, about what housing prices represent. The story goes something like this. $300,000 is a starter home, a reasonable entry point. Modest but functional, in a neighborhood that works with room to grow. $500,000 is the step up, the family home. The house where the life you've been building actually fits. And $1 million is luxury, space and quality, and the specific feeling of having arrived somewhere significant. That story made sense for a long time. In certain markets, at certain moments, it was roughly accurate. And because it was accurate in those places, it traveled, became part of the cultural understanding of what housing prices mean, what they represent, what they say about the life being purchased. The problem is that housing markets don't follow a universal scale. The same $300,000 buys something very different in San Francisco than it does in Columbus. $500,000 in Manhattan is not the same conversation as $500,000 in Memphis. $1 million in Los Angeles and $1 million in rural Tennessee are not purchasing the same thing, not even close. And yet the emotional weight attached to those numbers, the expectations that travel with them, tend to be more universal than the markets that would justify them. What kind of life does this price actually buy where you live? Let me draw a simple picture. Not a chart, just a way of thinking. Imagine 3 price tiers stacked on top of each other. $300,000 at the bottom, $500,000 in the middle, $1 million at the top. Simple enough. Now imagine that each tier is not a fixed thing, not a fixed size of house or a fixed quality of neighborhood, but a position within a market. And markets don't agree on what these positions mean. In the most expensive coastal metros, $300,000 is often not a house at all. It's a condo, a studio, or a one-bedroom in a building with an elevator and a monthly association fee. In a neighborhood that's convenient but not spacious. If you're lucky, there's outdoor space attached to the building. The $300,000 buys you the city, access to the market, a mortgage instead of a rent payment, a foothold. It does not buy you the house. In a mid-tier city, Nashville, Denver, Charlotte, somewhere that's been growing fast, but hasn't fully crossed into the territory of the most expensive markets. $300,000 gets you closer to the house in the story, a small one perhaps, an older one that needs attention, in an outlying neighborhood rather than the neighborhoods you looked at first. It's real, though. It has walls and a yard, rooms with doors that close. It's something. And in a lower-cost market, a mid-sized city in the Midwest or the South, a place that isn't attracting the same migration pressure, where land and construction costs haven't compounded the way they have elsewhere, $300,000 is the comfortable family home. 3 bedrooms, maybe 4, a real yard, a neighborhood that's been there for decades and isn't going anywhere. The house in the story, roughly, in a place where the story still holds. Same number. 3 different positions in 3 different realities. $500,000 carries a particular emotional weight. It's the number where people stop thinking of themselves as cautious and start thinking of themselves as committed. It's large enough to feel significant, large enough that spending it requires a specific kind of seriousness about what you're building. And in the cultural story about housing prices, it represents something real. The solidly good home. the house where life has room to breathe. In an expensive coastal metro, $500,000 is still, in most cases, not that house. It's an entry point. A small house in an outer neighborhood, or a condo in a more central one. The conversations that real estate agents have with buyers at this price point in New York or Seattle or the Bay Area are conversations about trade-offs. You can have the space or the location. You can have the neighborhood or the size. You can have the feeling of the home or the commute that makes the job practical. Most buyers at this price point in the expensive metros are making a version of that compromise, and most of them know it, even if they don't say it directly. In a mid-tier city, $500,000 shifts the conversation entirely. It buys the house, the one with the garage and the yard and the office that finally exists somewhere other than the kitchen table. It buys the neighborhood where the school district is good and the street is quiet, and the Saturday morning looks like what Saturday mornings are supposed to look like. It buys, in short, the thing that $500,000 is supposed to buy in the story. The story holds at this price point, in these markets, in a way it hasn't in the expensive ones for a decade or more. In a lower-cost market, $500,000 is the substantial home. More space than you need right now, in a neighborhood that has more amenities than the price would suggest anywhere else. At this price, in the right market, you begin to have options you weren't expecting. Properties with land, houses with character that have been maintained well, neighborhoods that feel genuinely established. The number goes further than it does anywhere else, and the distance it goes changes what's possible around it. How much of what you're paying for is the house, and how much is the location? Now $1 million. There is a version of that number that still exists in the popular imagination, the luxury home, the house that is unambiguously impressive. Generous in every dimension, space, finish, land, position within a neighborhood that signals everything the price is supposed to signal. The kind of home that, when you pull up in front of it, confirms something. In Los Angeles, in San Francisco, in Manhattan, $1 million is a starting point for the conversation. It buys something real, something substantially better than $500,000 in those same markets, but it does not buy the version of luxury that the number implies. It buys a house in a neighborhood that's good, with a kitchen that's been updated, in a size that's reasonable for a family, but not generous. In these markets, the word million has been quietly redefined. It no longer means what it used to mean and what it still means everywhere else. $1 million in Chicago, in parts of Texas, in growing southeastern cities, buys a home that is genuinely exceptional by the standards of that market. Space that reflects the number. A neighborhood that earns it. The kind of house that, in those cities, is genuinely at the upper end of what most people will ever consider. The number means what it sounds like it means, and in lower-cost markets, the parts of the country where median home prices are still well below the national average, $1 million is a different conversation entirely. It buys the best property on the street, or a significant piece of land with a house on it, or a home that, by any objective measure of size and condition and position, would be considered impressive. The number buys something in those markets that it stopped buying in the expensive ones long ago. Here is a story. His name is James. He grew up in the Midwest, moved to Seattle for his career, spent several years in a rental apartment while he built up what he needed to buy. When he started looking seriously, his budget was $450,000. He felt prepared. He'd done the research, run the numbers, understood what the market looked like. And what the market showed him was a version of homeownership he hadn't quite expected. The homes at his price point were smaller than the homes he'd grown up in a city with a fraction of Seattle's cost of living. The neighborhoods required trade-offs he hadn't fully anticipated. He bought, the right decision by most measures, a foothold in a market that continued to appreciate. But he spent the first several months quietly recalibrating his sense of what his purchase represented. The number felt like it should mean more than the house said it meant. The number felt bigger than the house. His college roommate, who had stayed in their hometown in Ohio, spent about the same amount the same year. He sent James a picture of the house. 4 bedrooms, a backyard with a deck, a 2-car garage. in a neighborhood with streets wide enough to feel genuinely suburban. James remembers sitting with his phone looking at that picture for a long time. Not with regret, exactly. The Seattle house was the right decision. The job was there, the career was there, the version of his life that made the most sense was there. But the picture did something to his understanding of what his number had purchased. The same dollars, spent by a person with a nearly identical financial background, had produced a fundamentally different physical reality. Not better or worse in any absolute sense, just different in ways that the number alone would never have predicted. He looked at the picture and understood for the first time that a dollar spent on housing in one place is not the same dollar spent somewhere else, that the number is not the measurement he thought it was. This is the psychological trap that almost nobody discusses before they enter the housing market. People don't just buy houses, they buy expectations tied to price. They carry a story about what a given number means, what it should look like, what kind of life it should produce, what it should say about where they've arrived. And the story is remarkably consistent across people with very different backgrounds, very different incomes, very different geographic histories. 300,000 feels like one thing, 500,000 feels like another, 1,000,000 feels like a third. The emotional associations are surprisingly universal, but the markets are not universal. And the collision between a universal emotional story and a highly local market reality is where a specific kind of disappointment lives. Not the dramatic disappointment of a bad decision, the quiet, persistent kind. The sense that the purchase didn't quite produce the life that was supposed to come with it. That the number felt like more than the house reflects. You've probably felt a version of this. Opening listings and finding that your price point produces something different in your market than it would somewhere else. Sending a link to a friend in another city and getting a message back about how different it looks from what they'd buy for the same money. Visiting a friend who bought in a lower-cost market and noticing, without saying it, that their house is bigger, that their mortgage might be smaller, that the ratio between what they earn and what they owe looks different from yours in a way that's hard to place. What the price actually buys has always depended on where you're buying. That's not new. But the gap between what prices mean in different markets has become wider in ways that weren't true a generation ago. The expensive markets have gotten significantly more expensive. The mid-tier markets have followed, in many cases, at a meaningful distance. The lower-cost markets have appreciated too, but from a different base, and the distance between the tiers has expanded. The result is that the cultural story about what prices mean has become increasingly disconnected from what prices actually deliver in the markets where most of the buyers are. The story was formed in a different market environment. It carries the memory of a time when $500,000 was a more universal signal, when the gap between markets was real but not this wide, when the number meant roughly the same thing in more places. That story is still being used to make decisions in a market that no longer reflects it. The question, then, is not whether $300,000, $500,000, or $1 million is expensive or reasonable or worth spending. Those questions matter, but they're not the right starting point. The right starting point is something more specific. In the market where you're buying, in the city, in the neighborhood, given what that number reaches at this particular moment, what does the price actually buy? What kind of life does it produce? What are the rooms like, and the neighborhood, and the commute, and the margin left in the budget after the payment clears each month? And perhaps more importantly, does the life the price produces in your market match the life you were expecting the price to produce? Because those two things, the expectation and the reality, are often not the same. The expectation is formed by the cultural story, by what the number sounds like, by what it means in other markets, or in memories of how markets used to work. The reality is local, specific, shaped by forces that have nothing to do with the number itself and everything to do with where the number is being spent. James and his college roommate spent nearly the same amount in the same year. They are not living the same life. The same number bought two completely different lives. The number wasn't the measurement. The place was.